All right. I hope everyone is well rested. I know last week was intense. We had our first paper due, and I'm so glad that we were able to get through it. I look forward to reading them. I'm getting ready to work on grading those now so we can look at revisions and we can go through that as we get closer to revision due date time. But what that means is that we now are wrapping up narrative and are moving on to comparison contrast. And we're going to spend 3 weeks on compare contrast. And so we're kind of spacing it out a little bit. And I just want to introduce the idea to you that comparison contrast essays are where you look at two or more things and look at and examine what they have in common and how they are different in terms of making some sort of argument. And I say argument in the sense of purpose. What are you trying to say? Because even with our narratives, yes, we're telling a story, but we're also looking at what we're saying, right? We never just do anything to do it, right? Like I'm not giving this video lecture right now just to give a video lecture. It's because I want you to like get this information, right? And so think of that in terms of compare contrast. But before we really, next week, we will actually look at the genre of compare contrast itself. This week, we're going to look at elements that I think are very important to understanding and constructing a compare contrast essay. The first is the rhetorical mode of description. So let's look at this example. In the essay, Once More to the Lake, where E.B. White writes about going out one morning in a rowboat with his young son, look at his description or how his and notice this has a very similarity with narrative. None of these, even though I'm teaching them as narrative, compare, contrast, argument, all these different things, they're not necessarily isolated. We use these different rhetorical modes within one another. And we'll see that in our readings this week. Both Mother Tongue by Amy Tan and The Struggle by Issa Rae use multiple elements. They classify, they describe, there's narrative involved, there's going to be straight argument involved. And that's really how true writing works. They combine the methods. But here in Intensive Comp, we look at them individually to be able to understand how they function before combining them all. So let's look at E.B. White's example. We went fishing the first morning. I felt the same damp moss covering the worms in the bait can and saw the dragonfly alight on the tip of my rod as it hovered a few inches from the surface of the water. It was the arrival of this fly that convinced me beyond any doubt that everything was as it always had been, that the years were a mirage and there had been no years. The small waves were the same, chucking the rowboat under the chin as we fished at anchor. And the boat was the same boat, the same freshwater leavings and debris, the dead hellgrammite, the wisps of moss, the rusty discarded fishhook, the dried blood from yesterday's catch. We stared silently at the tips of our rods, at the dragonflies that came and went. I lowered the tip of mine into the water, pensively dislodging the fly, which darted 2 feet away, poised, darted 2 feet back, and came to rest again a little further up the rod. I don't know about you, but E.B. White's descriptions here really help me picture this scene and feel as if I'm involved in it, right? He carefully, this wasn't by accident, he carefully, through writing, through revision, through re-examination, examined these details to create this illusion of standing still. And I argue that it's quite effective because I personally do not like fishing. I find it very dull, for lack of a better term. And this makes me really kind of wish I was there. All right, so telling how something looks, sounds, feels, smells, or tastes. The description appeals to imagery, which often when we're in school, we were taught that imagery refers to visual imagery, but it's any of the 5 senses, right? This essay or this excerpt from the essay gives the reader something to look at. We get the green boat, the rusty fish hook, we get to feel something, the damp moss, right? We hear the small waves and we smell the drying fish blood. Like, and especially even the idea of fishing or being on the sea, we've got, if it's, well, not the sea, they're on a lake, but potentially salt, right? Breeze, even wind can have a smell. Fish definitely has a smell. As for the taste, White appeals more directly to that sense later in the essay. We're not reading the full one. When he and his young son go to a nearby farmhouse for dinner, they eat fried chicken and apple pie. What does a subject look, sound, feel, or taste like? Those are the fundamental questions that descriptive writing addresses. And to be able to really, in my opinion, give a good comparison contrast, your audience has to really get a sense of what things are like. Description is a means of showing rather than telling. When we describe something, whether it's a person, a lake, a memory, a chemical reaction, so that the reader can experience it directly as we do. Description makes anything we write less abstract, less vague, less general, and more concrete. We're able to put our audience there. White, for example, he could just tell us that time seemed to stand still while he was on the lake, but he makes this abstract idea kind of timeless, much easier to grasp by showing us such specific details. We're thinking of description. Specificity is key. Objective description. Your reader will find almost anything you write easier to comprehend if you describe your subject vividly. However, in a personal essay about your grandmother's cooking, you're probably going to describe things differently than if you're writing like an academic essay or a lab report about dissecting a frog. There are two ways of describing something, objectively or subjectively. An objective description presents its subject impartially. Its purpose is to provide the reader with information. So let's look at that, describing this watershed in Alaska. Duck Creek is a small anadromous, which means running upriver from the sea, fish stream located in an old outwash channel of the Mendenhall Glacier in the center of the most unpopulated residential area of Alaska capital, Juneau. Duck Creek supports a large overwintering population of coho salmon juveniles that migrate into the stream each fall from the estuarine wetlands. And that is from the Environmental Protection Agency's article, Make Way for Salmon in Duck Creek. In the EPA's description, it's objective, not only because it uses precise scientific terms, but because it's made up entirely of factual information about the subject, the size, where it's located, type of fish. A subjective description provides information too, but it also conveys the writer's personal response to the subject being described, as in this piece from an article about a visit to the Iowa State Fair. And then I wound up at an open-air brick pavilion for the llama judging. Llamas are gentle, dignified beasts, and here were 4 of them being shown by teenagers. The animals' military bearing, heads high, their stately gait, their dark, soulful eyes. They looked as if they'd walked straight out of Dr. Dolittle. According to a poster, they are raised for fiber, showing, carting, guardians, and companionship. One girl stood by her llama and blew gently on its nose, and he looked lovingly into her eyes. A sort of conversation. If every teenager had his or her own llama, this would be a very different country. This is by Garrison Keeler from the article, from the essay, A Sunday at the State Fair. This description is very subjective, as opposed to the one by the EPA. The author feels or imagines that the llamas are dignified and loving, and that one is having a conversation. He mentions his own opinion that if every teenager had his or her own llama, this would be a very different country. But he does provide objective details as well, right? The physical location, the number of llamas, the age, the exact words on the poster. Most descriptions you use, depending on your purpose, are going to combine subjective and objective. Okay, let's look at when subjective goes too far. So according to the region's official website, the area around the lake that E.B. White wrote about is famous for its sparkling scenic streams and chain of 7 lakes, its panoramic views of fields, hills, and woodlands, its inviting towns and villages. Sounds nice, right? Oh, a sparkling stream, a panoramic view. But the same could be said of a car wash, right? Where you're looking at what's going on in the car wash. It's no actual impression. I don't know what it actually looks like. It's merely just these abstract qualities. A good descriptive writing is built on concrete particulars. So don't just write like, oh, it was dark and stormy. Try to make the reader go or appeal against that imagery. Make them see, hear, and feel that wind and the rain if you're talking about a dark and stormy night. Always show, do not tell. Think about your purpose when you're writing and including descriptions in your comparison contrast essay. Your purpose in describing something, capture it in a certain light or mood, express your feelings about it, persuade the reader, or merely to amuse. For example, like in the official website for the lakes that E.B. White writes about, it promotes family vacations, right? It includes details to encourage wholesome family, as their words, and activities for all ages, and leaves out some of the details like E.B. White mentioned, like dead insects, rusty fishhook, dried blood. Parting words. Remember your purpose. Descriptions are never purposeless. All right. And that brings us also into something that is very connected to purpose. And that is, classification. What is this doing? There we go. All right. Breaking a subject into categories. So let's say you've just survived a hurricane. The power is back on, so is the water. However, the roof has blown off. Something we can relate to here in Southeast Louisiana, right? What kind of roof did you have? Which kinds held up well in the storm? What kind should you put back on your house? These are questions of classification. So when you describe something, you say what the characteristics are. Classification is concerned with characteristics too. When you classify something, you name the category it belongs to. Is it a dolphin? Is it a manatee? Or is it introverted, extroverted? It builds on the descriptions and characteristics to put things into categories. When classifying individuals, we sort them into groups. For example, dog is a hound and one is a terrier, right? They're both dogs, but there is a difference between a hound and a terrier. We divide them into subgroups. So there's hounds, terriers, retrievers. All of them are dogs. Bicycles, there's street bikes, mountain bikes, racing bikes, road bikes, motorcycles, right? Or a type of bike. We can even break it down into motorized bikes and traditional bikes, right? For our purpose in understanding rhetorical modes today, we'll use the term classification to refer to sorting and dividing. We classify things in order to choose the kinds that best meet our needs. So if the hurricane hits and neither tile nor asphalt roof stood up well, we might want to look at what other kinds are there and what kind is most likely to survive a high wind. Choosing among similar kinds of objects or ideas is only one reason for using classification. Think of, we classify things for many purposes, right? To evaluate a good dog, a bad dog, kindness and, kind of maliciousness. To determine causes, the cause of weather, pilot error, mechanical failure. To conduct experiments, we got a test group and a control group, right? If we go back to our biology terms. And to measure results, we've got winners, losers, runners up, people who did not qualify, all of those things. So why do we classify? And it's humans. Our brains want to classify things. For better or for worse, we want to it makes our brains want to put things in order and make sense of them. And in a world that often seemingly does not always make sense, right? So consider like the duck-billed platypus. Even though it has a bill and it lays eggs, biologists classify it as a mammal with some bird-like characteristics rather than a bird with mammalian ones. Why? It's not that it has mostly mammalian traits such as hair and milk and glands and all these other things. It turns out that the platypus, along with another animal, makes up a class of mammals separate from the rest. In their research to put the platypus in its place, biologists have learned that many types of mammals once had bird-like traits over the course of evolution. However, only the platypus and the anteater have retained those. And why is it not showing me? And that's why they're classified that way. So why do we classify? By accurately classifying the platypus, this unusual mammal, we can discover not only where each one belongs in the scheme of things, but also more about the basis of natural order itself. And so, in a comparison contrast, we do put things into categories, right? And what do they have in common and whether they have differently. I really hope you enjoy the essays this week. Both of these are, I know we've read Amy Tan before. I've said it. I do love her as an author. And Issa Rae is really she's an actress, for those who are unfamiliar with her. She wrote and starred in the show on HBO, Insecure. And she's very insightful and very funny. And I hope you do enjoy these and see how both of these women are using these modes in their writing. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out.